you're going to have a treat this morning. It's the second in our track of emerging technologies, and I'm very happy to say we've got the two Davids here, the Fosway Davids, David Perring and David Wilson here, and they're going to take the whole show right the way through for an hour, talking to you about various things. The title, I think, is intriguing. Don't believe the hype. I think that's going to challenge us. But who's actually heard of Fosway 9 Grid? There's quite a few of you. So they're going to talk more about that with you. They're going to do some stuff about data analysis, and they're going to get you involved in the research. So I'm going to hand over now to David Wilson. Please welcome them both to the stage.
Thank you. Swap. I'm going to get off stage. I'll go a bit left. So I thought Steve said good. It's still morning, but I thought he said it's still boring. So, but anyway, so good morning to everybody from us as well, and thanks for coming. For anybody who's coming in, there's seats, more seats this side if you want to come over. Thanks very much for coming to the session, and I hope we find it interesting. We kind of, probably many of you have seen us present before and talking about stuff, so we really want to try and give you a sense around what's really going on in the market and how that's impacting, in particular in this session, the kind of a whole digital learning landscape, and then looking into the learning systems choices and options that companies are making. Fosway, if you're not aware of us, we're an industry analyst. So what that means is we analyze the market. We analyze what corporates are doing, who they're doing it with, what works, what doesn't, and what they think of the suppliers they're working with. And we publish lots of research around that. We do quantitative market research and trends, and we're going to talk about some of that data now, including our digital learning realities research, which we do in association with Learning Technologies, so we're the closest still guys who organize these conferences. We also do a lot of qualitative research with corporate clients, particularly mid and large enterprise type organizations. I set up Fosway 23 years ago, scarily enough. In reality, we've seen a lot of things change in that time and a lot of things not change in that time, etc. But obviously the appetite for technology continues to always grow. We also publish independent vendor commentary. So Steve asked the question around the Fosway 9 grids. So we're the main industry analyst in the EMEA market. So things like our 9 grids for learning systems, which I'm going to talk about a lot more later, but also for cloud HCM, for talent management, and now also in the recruiting market as well, are pretty much the only market analysis tools in Europe. So we get, each one of these will get downloaded and used by 2,500 to 3,000 companies plus, as well as all the physical copies that we hand out at events, etc. Each of you, I think, on your desk, on your chairs, desks, God, each of them on your chairs has got a buyer's guide where we try to pull together a few kind of things around it, but it also includes in the middle the latest 2020 9 grids, etc. And I'll come back and talk about those later. So that's kind of who Fosway is. I've got. Before you get too complacent and maybe we go boring rather than morning, I want you to do some work, okay? So get out your mobile phones. I know you've been told to turn them off. And we're going to give you some time to do this. It's up to you. If you can get the QR code to work, we're going to take you to a survey, okay? And there's just a few questions in the survey, but what we're trying to do is get a sense for this room in where you are around your maturity, particularly around different types of learning systems, and the way you're looking at that. So there's 3 or 4 questions only. It will take you a few minutes. 3 minutes, David, was it?
Yeah, 4 maybe.
Right, 3 to 4 minutes. It's according to the Survey Monkey to do. And we're actually going to show the results of this later on. All right, so please take a couple of minutes and do it. Thank you.
Yeah, the URL is https :/www.research.net, and then it's /r/LTC20. So Learning Technologies Conference 20. If you haven't got a QR code with it. If you want to come and get a bit closer, because you're a bit too much on the side, without creating a health and safety hazard, you can come and scan, but maybe it's easier just to type it in.
You're telling me I'm too tall and I'm standing in front of the QR code? Does it work? Can you get the survey up? Okay. we always try and do something interactive in these things. So,
But basically what you're going to get asked is what sort of systems you have and how long have you had them. If you don't have it, just say don't use. And that actually makes the next bit a little bit shorter, not wanting to discourage you from being total on disclosure. In terms of the next set of questions, which we just filtered down to say, what do you think of the things that you've got? There's also some nice simple questions about, for your learning ecosystem overall, do you think it's fit for the modern workforce? And as I said, we'll try and revisit that halfway through the presentation, as David said, so it'll be interesting. We've got a few responses in there already, just so we've got a chart and a dashboard ready to go. What we will do is share the dashboard with you,
yes.
so that you can look and see amongst all your peers, the people that are sat next to you. You won't know who they are, where they come from, but you will get a sense of the responses. This is a completely anonymous survey. We will not be able to follow up with you or find out what you said. Nobody else will either. So, but it's just, you've just got a temperature check on how long you've had your systems and what you think of them ultimately.
Anybody finished yet?
No.
Okay.
Halfway through? No.
Total silence is good, I think.
I hate silence. It's a bit scary. It's not what you expect from a presentation, is it really?
No. Be radical. Don't say anything. How you doing?
I have to be very careful. I'm not allowed to name Mender, am I? That would be particularly harsh. But,
So let me carry on whilst you're just finishing that off with the things, because next couple of slides are nice, easy ones, so you don't have to look at those. One thing that we get asked quite a lot, because in the learning market particularly, people don't really understand what an industry analyst is. And I think the key thing, what we're trying to do is, and if you want to take anything into what comes in the next hour or a little bit less, is think around, what is going to help you understand what's possible, what isn't, what those supplier options are, and how to, if you pardon my French, cut through the crap and understand what's relevant for you. All right? Because I'm sure you've all been downstairs. I've always seen the marketing noise of everybody selling their next-gen VR learning experience platform with embedded AI. And what we really want to be able to do is try and give you some kind of guidance and a sense about how we look at this from an analyst point of view, and maybe how you can start thinking around that. From an agenda point of view, we kind of split this in two halves to some degree. The first part, which is David's going to really talk about our digital learning realities research and take you through some of those slides, and a little bit into how that's changing a bit the way that the learning systems market. And then we're going to, the second half, where we're going to focus around the 9-grid for learning systems particularly. I'm going to give you a bit more information around how it's actually constructed. So what's behind it, because we get asked questions around that. But in particular, to talk about 2020, we made a massive change, okay? And to give you an example, the LinkedIn page where we announced that change, I checked just before we came on, has got the best part of 28,000 plus views on it. So it's created a big kind of big response in terms of the market. So that's the way we're kind of splitting from a presentation point of view. If you stand all the way over there, I can't give you the... So.
There's some great footage of me falling off a stage twice in the same presentation. If you look back, Kate's laughing, and anybody else who might have been there. The funniest thing was the level of gasp from the audience as I stepped off. So I'm not coming back on. I'm going to walk around off down the stage.
I'm just thinking of the camera guy.
It'll keep him busy. So we're just going to go through some of the results based on our interim survey. Every year related to the Learning Technologies event, we ask some pretty just simple questions, which hopefully hold up a mirror to you as an audience, as a buyer community and a seller community to understand what's going on. At the moment, we've had about 400 survey respondents. We launched it, I think, about the middle of January. We're going to leave this open. So if you ever go to our survey URL, it'll just keep on ticking over. We've had 20, 30 go on even today. So please share your insights. We do not share your data with anybody. We only use the data to help inform you around what's going on. We might send you an email and say, this is what we found, right? An infographic may come out in a couple of months' time. But most of the respondents are European, got over 80%, so it's the voice of a European customer base. It's not about US, it's not about Asia, it's about here. Of those respondents, most of the organizations they work for are over 1,000 employees. So they're large and mid-sized organizations in a way. So that's a real nice sweet spot around what's going on. And over half of those are larger organizations, over 5,000 employees. So they are people who have complex environments with difficult problems to solve, right? And this is the view that we're effectively trying to gather. Your involvement in contributing to the survey is so important. If we only have one respondent or 100 respondents, it's not as valuable as having the 1,500 we've had in previous years. So it's really nice for you to share, and our purpose is not to make money out of it other than give it back to you. Sometimes we use data elsewhere, but that's only to talk just generally about the movements that are happening, right? But we never mention you or your company. Overall, some of the things that we asked the survey around were things around learning experience. I've got some questions around that you can have a look at. We've also got some things around what's happening around skills. And I think what's one of the most interesting things as a result of the World Economic Forum report, which is now coming into almost 2 years old, right, around what are the biggest challenges for the world economy over the next 5 years or so, was the gaps in skills. Even Tim Berners-Lee talks about the scale of STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, being a great inhibitor around the future development and economic capability of Europe and companies within Europe. And you have pretty much so far re-endorsed that view, okay? If you look at the chart, 90% of you say that skills is an issue. And I think that's an interesting thing, a lens to put onto the sorts of solutions that you're putting into place, the sorts of programs you're putting into place, and the sorts of goals that you understand which relate to skills in your organization. And I think it's interesting. How many of you at the moment have a skills agenda in your company about growing skills into the future? Okay. Now what you have to realize, those people who didn't put their hand up, is one of the key drivers for employees to join you as new starters is the ability for them to develop and grow. That is their number one driver. If they are not growing, they're looking to work somewhere else. And in the war for talent, and there's allegedly 756,000 jobs which are shortfalled in Europe around technology. 1 in 4 finance companies left the vacancy open because they couldn't fulfill it, because they couldn't find the person with the right skills. If you haven't got your hand up, you're all behind in the race to attract people. You're behind in the race to retain people. And this is a really big, important agenda. Move on.
Yeah,
there we go.
You might be better, that's fine.
The other thing, just more generally, we've asked this question over 3 years around, is your learning team going through a digital transformation? And when we started, 70% were in progress. Now, in 2020, we're up to 76%. So it's almost like we've had a little bit of an inflection point of people saying, it's not for me, it's not something I'm planning for, it's something I'm doing. And I'm actively trying to modernize my learning team, my learning department. David, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no,
to
I mean,
that.
I think the one thing, we used to make a joke of the 4% that, or is it 4%?
Yeah, 4%.
Whatever it is, that didn't think it was relevant to them, to be a digital thing. Now, obviously, I think the point is made, it's now 0, you know. So it's also interesting when we used to make a bit of a joke, say in progress hides everything from barely started to think I'm just about to finish, but realised I'm only taking my first step on the journey. And I think there's a big range in terms of those things. Clearly it's a big bucket, but you can see a little bit in terms of those that are kind of getting towards the end. The ones that were not relevant are into planning, but that's, you know, this is slow, really slow kind of progress.
But I think what's interesting is that 15% who say they completed. I think in the past we'd have been, do you ever complete transformation? And probably the answer is no. But I think on the other side, you do get step change. So I think as a recognition of, we have tried to move the agenda significantly forward, and that things seem to be moving in that direction. This is not an end point in a way, it's just once you get to completed, you're on your journey of continuous improvement, right? And everybody's in that journey, both as an individual and as an organization, so it's going to keep moving. The other thing, and I think this is a consistently scary chart, and again, we started to ask this not just in learning and talent, we've also asked it around HCM platforms, HR platforms more generally, is, do you think your current platforms, in this instance learning platforms, are fit for the modern workforce? Okay. I tend to think if you don't know, that's a no, right? But look at the numbers. It was 50% said no last year. The level of dissatisfaction, and this is on our interim numbers, seems to be growing. People want more from their platforms. They want more in terms of what it can do. And I'm sure this maybe is reflective maybe of your experience. Actually, we bought something a while ago. The goalposts are moving. Maybe it's the skills agenda which is changing the way you want to deliver learning. There are lots of drivers. But I think this is really interesting things that only 29%, small shrink, say yes. So a third of you in this room are happy. The rest of you are thinking, my God, what's happened to learning in my organisation?
One thing I'd add to that is we do a lot of the stuff that we do, and you see for us in learning, we also do with HR and talent and recruiting as well. So, and that answer is not massively different in the HR world as well. So basically what we're seeing is a growing crisis in some ways of the belief that companies have that what they have is even vaguely fit for purpose for the workforce that they're trying to employ, let alone the level of change to come, right? Because remember, a lot of this, most of these things is before AI.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is trying to understand, so why is that so? What would make it a yes rather than a no? And I think if you encourage that dialogue, not just within your own learning teams, but with your business partners, your business stakeholders, and your end users, is probably where you need to be in order to make better choices next time round. In terms of just the trends, though, there seems to be an unrelenting shift towards technology. The green bit shows where people are going to increase their spend around digital learning. The orange bit is stay the same. People always expect you to do more with less or more with the same. And the red is where we're expecting to decrease our spend, right? Just overall. And then the greys are, I don't know. Again, on balance, all of those pretty much point to an increase with the exception of digital learning services. Trying to do more yourself seems to be a little bit of a trend, but there are challenges around that in terms of then your cost elsewhere. Okay, top areas for growth, content and platforms. I think the thing is you can pick out each one of these as an individual layer. You can think each one of these happens in isolation, but invariably what really happens is you get combinations, and that creates something that is a bit more irresistible. So video content, which is on your mobile, which is user-generated, probably sounds more interesting than just video-based learning, right? Things like micro-learning, which is user-generated, which is part of a blend and video-based on access via mobile, seems to have more of a punch, right, than just saying it's just going to be blended. And I think that is an interesting thing of these aren't trends in isolation. They are trends which almost coalesce together based around the needs that you have to solve in your organization. On the platform side, the driver has consistently over the last few years been around analytics. It's been about the social collaborative. What's interesting, if you look right down the bottom, is the split between people who say they are going to increase, which is what most of those percentages on the left mean, so I'm going to do more of this, as opposed to, on the elements I've got the minus, are those people who are going to start to do less of this. So there seems to be a little bit of a reaction based around that it's not the experience I want to give to my people, which is creating this little bit of a kickback around the LMSs. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about almost where the market is and what we're seeing emerge in the market related to that as well. I think it's probably useful to picture that and also get a sense of what might happen, our prediction around that too.
Yeah, I mean the other thing I would add is that even when you look at the LMS one, you're still seeing 40% of companies increasing their investment there.
Yeah.
So that's we're a long way from the death of LMS story, despite what you may have heard in the market. And the reality is actually, all the drivers for that have not gone away. Companies still need to be able to do that stuff, but they also want to be able to do more next-gen, better experiences and so on. And this is what we're going to drive into in the second half. We'll talk about a little bit more.
Okay, so go on. And then just in terms of when you intend to change your platforms, basically the green says in the next 12 months, then darker green 2 years, orange is 2 to 3 years, and then you've got no changes expected. So it just gives you a sense of the timeline. So the things where people expect to be spending their money faster rather than later is in the analytics, the content authoring, which surprised us, but maybe people are thinking about changing their content delivery models, and their historic platforms don't really enable that. Virtual classrooms is an interesting one. I'm sure that's not in relation to people not wanting to travel because of coronavirus, who knows, but maybe that will come. Learning management systems, again, increased spend, all these areas. What's interesting is the NGLEs are down the bottom because people have probably been investing in learning experience platforms more recently. So they probably got 2 to 3 year contracts going on. So it's been a little bit of a breakthrough maybe in recent years around that. Has anybody got any questions? Are you happy for me to move on, just to skip over it? If you've got anything, just put your hand up and we'll take a question. Sorry, gentleman over here.
Can you give me an explanation of next-gen learning environment?
Yeah, okay. Do you mind if I park that one? Because I do have a slide which will help us maybe talk about what that means. We've heard a lot about people talk about learning experience platforms, but I think the difficulty, and what we'll show you a bit later, is what do you mean by learning experience? Is that about the UI onto the platform, or is it about hyper-personalization, or is it because you want it to happen in the workplace? So actually the description and the context really is quite varied. Sorry, gentleman at the back here, sorry. We will be able to look at that and probably start to tease some of that out a little bit more when we get bigger numbers. Currently we've had about 400 respondents, but as you get to 1,500 it starts to show, and we can take the split between the size of the organisation and the characteristics. What we'd ideally like to be able to do is get you to say, this is my provider, this is what I think of them, I'm this sort of organisation, so we get a profile of actually who's really successful with this provider, and just help people then make better decisions around matching their provider to their own scale.
Yeah, I'll come back to that topic a bit later on when we put up the 9 grid, because there's an easy way of having that conversation a little bit around it.
I'm staying away from the stage, I don't want to fall off again.
Yeah. He did actually fall off the stage.
You can watch it, it's all on video. The shame lives with me still.
So, let's see if this works. This is where we find out how fast their internet connection is.
Ooh.
Slow.
What we were trying to do with the questions, I know there's quite a few of them, but I think it was representative of all the sorts of solutions that end up being plugged into your ecosystem. Whether they're owned by the suite or whether they're specialist tools, you tend to have these things that start to get plugged in, and then to get a sense of how long you've had them gives you a sense of actually how long have you sometimes carried them as a point of pain and burden, and really where you are in some of the recency. And then we've got some other things which help us see what you think about them. And is there a pattern to, actually, I've had it for a long time, and familiarity breeds contempt, if that phrase translates. So I don't like it just because it's been around a while, right? Or is it just sometimes things don't work well enough? So try and pick that out.
Yeah, so we'll put the benchmark up, we'll tweet the link to it so you can actually look at that later as well. I mean, the key thing in looking at it, so one of the reasons I thought this was an interesting thing to do is we're at a Learning Technologies conference, right? The clue, as it says, is on the name. So theoretically, if you're here, you're probably more interested or more experienced in looking at shock horror learning technologies. So we know that from our own research, when we look at a lot of our corporate, the deeper relationships, we've got people on the very, very high end of experience in terms of they have done 4, 5, 6, 7 generations of LMS projects and have kind of worked out what doesn't work. They still, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, maybe still only have a 50-50 chance of saying it's a good outcome when they make that next change, and that's obviously what we're trying to help with. But you can see a little bit around experience profile here, so obviously the darker that is in the top, the more people have got, and you can also see if you're feeling underwhelmed because you haven't got a learning experience platform or you haven't got performance support, whatever it is, you can also see the bits that most people don't have as well. The next thing was around satisfaction. Okay, so with the satisfaction, green, the bits at the bottom will show you a level of satisfaction. Again, we've got other kind of data points around this. On average, we see pretty much a kind of 50% kind of thing around people that think it's good versus people that think it's kind of okay or poor or worse, etc. And you can see the variation here. One of the things that's surprising, and we've got some other data points in a second, is that although there's a lot of noise, for example, about LMS, people not liking LMSs, when you look at their satisfaction with social learning platforms or with MOOCs or with LXPs or with virtual reality, often it's as bad, right? But just less people have it, so there's less noise about it. So that's one of the things, again, to think about in terms of it. And then just coming down to the kind of couple of charts at the bottom, and again, we'll come back and talk about this. So do you think you're fit for the modern workforce? 48%. So we've got 27% maybe, all right, and 48% no. So only 21% saying yes. So that's not massively different. And again, this is, bear in mind when we're doing research, we're trying to hit a broader audience than just people who come to a learning technologies event. Then, so we've got, this sample is representative of the broader market, etc. And the final question there was about the fragmented ecosystem, right? So one of the things that we've been talking about in HR, in talent, in learning, in recruiting, is it's always about ecosystem, it's not about a system. However much the big LMS companies or the big ATS companies in recruiting want to tell you it's all about, or the big HCM companies want to tell you it's all about one system, it's never about one system, right? It's always about an ecosystem. And is it, this question, is that a blessing or a curse, right? And I think the key thing, it's reality, right? So if you think it's a blessing, how are you exploiting it? If you think it's a curse, what are you doing to manage your risks and your things and turning it into a blessing?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that sense of when you have an ecosystem, actually what tends to happen is you're much more responsive when you have more fragmentation because you can do things simpler and quicker. But it's the overhead of managing lots of suppliers and lots of interfaces, lots of help, different support desk queries and all these things, which make it a curse. And it's really difficult to try and find a way of both narrowing down the range of solutions that you have to make it manageable for your team, because you probably can't have a team of 20 to administer 20 different platforms. But also have the flexibility within the range of solutions that you do have, so you can be agile and respond quickly. And I think it's one of the real differences of challenges of what resources do you have as a team to be able to execute complexity? And lots of people don't have a big team. They have a lot of complexity, so they need to actually try and solve that with simplicity. And this is a lot of tension, and I think we find lots of organizations working
Exactly, and
through
that kind of plays back to the question we were asked earlier, does this get impacted by the size of the organization? Absolutely, right? Because if you're not a huge company, and even if you're a company with maybe 5,000 employees, the amount of resources you have dedicated to running learning systems is probably at best one, right, person. And if you're a very large global company, maybe you have teams of people, but they're all running different stuff and they're not joined up. So, obviously size does impact this in terms of it, as does market sector as well. It's different for retailers, from manufacturers, from things, but actually a lot of the core patterns are similar.
But I think also, just to add to that as well, thinking back to one of the survey results from earlier on, where it talked about the balance of investment between platform and service was the one that almost felt as though it was shrinking. The thing that you tend to suffer with around platform is people just sell you the platform. You delivering it, that's your problem. If it fails, it's your fault. The service that happens around it, you have to deliver. And I think there is a little bit of a tension or expectation from us to think, I bought the platform, therefore it works, without thinking, actually, I've got to put a lot of effort into supporting and maintaining and keep continually running and investing and managing the supplier. So thinking about how you balance the software and the license fee to how you service the your customers, your learners themselves, is part of the tension of creating that true view of total cost of ownership, and we tend to miss that a little bit in how we buy.
There's a quote I made probably about 10 years ago when I was asked in a public thing like this and said, what proportion of the time do you think people make good decisions and buy good platforms? And I said, it's a good question. I've got an answer, an anecdotal answer, but it's the wrong question. And I said, well, what's the right question? I said, how often do they buy a good platform and still screw it up? Right? Because that's the scary bit. The reality is if you're looking at 50-50 good decision, 25% chance of implementing it really well, that's still a low outcome percentage, and I think that's what you need to think. And a lot of that then comes into how you engage, etc. But in the world of cloud, where most of the software vendors want you to do most of the work, that becomes a bigger problem. Yeah. So I want to just speed up a little bit on the thing. So we've got a couple of slides which I'm going to talk through quickly on market, and then I want to shift onto the 9 grid. One of the things we wanted to do, this is kind of stuff that David's been playing with around, like this is like a normal market adoption type curve, is basically overplaying on that, where we are then in terms of adoption around platforms, okay? So one of the things that's really obvious is, we know LMS is a mature market, okay? It's been around for a long time, over 20 odd years. We know that the majority of companies have got them. Still not everybody, but it's definitely a late majority, if not a laggard market overall, but there's loads of change within that stuff. Social as a story has been around for a long time. It's definitely kind of moved across into there. A lot of the other things that we're talking about are very much early majority stuff. So they're very early on in terms of the kind of adopter curve around it. And that's also then reflected through in terms of high hype, not necessarily high outcome, right? So that for us is an interesting space. but it's also an area where I think it creates the risks as you get further down for you in making good decisions obviously is higher.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is not all these dots on the left-hand side are moving at the same pace, right? So if you look at employee performance systems, like EPSS one, people have been talking about employee performance solutions since the 1990s. Gloria Gray wrote a great book about it, right? It's been really slow moving, hard to adopt to some extent. And that's been almost stuck in that layer forever. LXPs has probably burst onto the scene over the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah. So it's been a fast mover. The thing about the LMS is in that space of what do they do now? And if people are eating their market, what do they do? What would you do? Yeah. So I either have to add it.
Become an LXP, yeah.
Or I buy it.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's
the
what
way the markets start to move. And it's just a matter of knowing how you're influencing as a customer that movement within your provider. Because at some point you might have to say, oh, you're a busted flush, guys. I need to move on because you're not keeping pace. I need to find somebody who's going to keep up with the pace of innovation that's required for my organization.
And remember, if you go back to our kind of research premise, what are you doing? Who are you doing it with? What works, what doesn't? What do you think of them? That's the insight that we're getting all the time from that process in understanding not just who's buying new stuff, but what doesn't work about the stuff they've got and how do they fit that together.
But what I was going to say is just one final thing is, the pace that your provider is moving maybe starts to force you to come up with decisions about, do I extend my ecosystem by adding an LXP on, or do I wait for them to buy? Right? And that's the sort of pressure that you need to be in a place of, actually, if you need to deliver change fast, you might think, actually, that's a really good answer. Right. And I will take the consequences, but I know it's a transitional step to help me learn how to do it, but also provide a better level of service. But it may not be a strategic choice longer term, maybe it will be. But if you wait, maybe that hurts you more. It's a choice you have to make.
So how many people in the room feel a bit like that? Right. Come on, be bold. I'm sure there's some vendors in the room, but hey, they don't know who you are. So yeah, I mean that's obviously the dynamic you're seeing in the market, in some ways in the noise in the market, etc. So we'll look at that a little bit more detail. When you say to people, what's the highest priority in terms of driving those things? And again, we'll make these slides will be available afterwards. They're available on our events page. And also, if you finish the survey, it took you to a landing page, hopefully. The slides are also available on there, so you can access them, etc. as well. But by means, keep taking pictures if you want. So, I mean, obviously you can see there, there's a lot of noise, obviously, around user experience and personalization, etc., and things like that. But actually, a lot of this is about relevance. It's how do I increase the relevance for the people, right? So that's what personalization is trying to do to some degree. But, how do we align stuff to people based on what their jobs and needs are? Right? That's not a rocket science stuff. But ultimately, that makes a massive difference, not just in terms of the experience they feel they have, also in the level of utilization. We do a lot of independent vendor briefings, etc. I was talking to somebody this morning, and they were saying that somebody noticed that they had almost like 1,000-fold increase in content utilization. And they got it because what they were doing was just had a good way of pointing people to stuff that was relevant, as opposed to, here's SharePoint, it's got 1 million documents in, go and look at it, guys. Right, which doesn't work. So yeah, there's lots of things around this. Again, we'll make these slides later. Again, one of the things we quite like looking at is around the maturity model, but in a little bit more of a multi-dimensional way. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. And I think what I did a while ago, last year, was just think, with all the things that people say is a learning experience, how can you segment this to actually try and understand what people mean? Because LXP is such a broad spectrum. And then starting to pick out on the key themes. And there seem to be 3 key themes that seem to come out. And there's an overlap, right? It's not discrete, hard boundaries between any of this stuff. But on the left-hand side, you've got things about, actually, our learning experience, the front end of the platform isn't very good. And that's what we suffer maybe with some of the lack of investment from the traditional learning management systems in their front end, and the focus on the user experience. So actually having an aggregation of lots of portals, because we've got 10 different LMSs plus 10 different providers, is an interesting answer to that problem. Learning content, social ranking is something that actually makes it easier for people to find stuff, for example. Content alignment around diagnostics and roles, so actually I've got some business measures that help me find the right content. That sounds a bit more learning management-y type stuff. Adaptive content delivered to me based on who I am, what I know, my individual circumstances, based on pre-prescribed things like role, region, responsibilities, competencies, those are on there. But that starts to blend then into the workplace experience of how can I create user-generated content that I can share with others? How can I use support in the workflow? All the way through then over to the stuff on the right-hand side, which is actually how do I create a genuinely personalized experience which is just me? It knows my drivers, it knows my agenda, it knows how often I click in, and a bit like a proactive marketing tool gives me that nudge to say 94 of your peers have, or 94% of your peers have completed this program, have got a promotion. Are you interested? Right? And give people that proactive nudge to enable them to be more of themselves, bring their best selves to work. So we sort of see that almost as a system and content focused experience through to the individual and team experience, with work being part of the place where really we see teams and the individual work together, collaborate, work together as a whole.
And there's a clear conclusion you can have here. It's like talking about learning experience or learner experience and talking about it, learning experience platforms, as if they're a singular thing is completely stupid. Right? Is that a simple enough statement? It is really completely stupid. It's very multidimensional. And the idea that there is a single category that helps you do that is equally stupid. Unfortunately, it dominates a lot of the marketing thinking of a lot of the vendors, and unfortunately, some of the analyst thinking of some of the analysts. But in reality, it's never been true. And I think understanding how you unpick it and work out for your organization what your priorities are is also important. And I think, you know, we're interested though in the experience. We're not saying experience is a bad thing, okay? But ultimately what comes back to it is probably the kind of most influential thing is how we connect the ecosystem together, how we actually do that. Yes, we want to maybe, you know, increase our kind of focus around learning experience. These two big ones at the top, how we connect that ecosystem together. But the challenge is ultimately, for most of you, is your ecosystem maybe experience feels a bit more like that, you know? So we can talk about this till the cows come home, but are we designing monsters here? Or are we even just inheriting monsters rather than designing them, okay? So thinking about what you're trying to do. So what I now want to do really is to kind of move on a little bit and then load this conversation in really to talking about things like the Fosway 9 grids that you've got on the buyer's guide stuff, and then really think about how we're using that analysis to try and deconstruct this. If I can press the thing. So really, actually a key theme for us in 2020 is, you know, the 9 grids are the main buying call tools, actually globally, I would say, around on our learning system. So for us, rethinking the way we categorize it was really a big deal. But I think it's really important based on a lot of the narrative that we've just talked about. And ultimately, the thing around this is, you know, it's 50-50 chance of a good outcome. Is that a good thing for you to be doing? We'd like you to make better decisions about core acquisitions, but also the more you think about this as a multidimensional problem, the harder that gets. And the more you're interested in the early part adopter curve, the riskier it gets in some ways, because they're more of an unknown, they're quite divergent, even though they may be using similar marketing categories. So the 9 grid, I just want to give you a few slides. You've all seen 9 grids, or most of you have, and you can see it if you look on the front page of this. So we publish these for a whole range of different areas, not just for learning. And the reports are accessible. Everybody knows the diagram, right? What I would say to you is read the report, yeah? Because underneath that, it tells you how it's constructed. It tells you how to read it, okay, et cetera. And that's really important. It also tells you a distillation of what we see as the key trends impacting the market, and then ultimately the buying decisions as well. So it's really, really useful, and I'll re-emphasize that again in a bit. It's a multi-dimensional model, so it's not like a Gartner Magic Quadrant, which is a dot on a 2D grid. Okay, it's a multi-dimensional. We're looking at performance and potential. We're looking at market presence. We're looking at total cost of ownership. How much is it going to cost you to buy, own, implement, own, and operate? Yeah. And we're looking at the trajectory of that vendor, okay? And that trajectory is typically relative to themselves. So it's much more multidimensional. Unfortunately, the analyst firms globally, the IT analysts, have trained everybody to think top right is the place to look, right? But that's really kind of ridiculous, because if you've got a company which has got limited amounts of resources, or, you know, for you, operating margin is really critical, why the hell are you looking at the most expensive solutions in the market? Surely you should be looking at fit for purpose, fast time to operate, fast time to value. Okay, so these looking at it on a multi-dimensional basis is really important. We have massive amounts of data for us. Building a 9-grid from scratch is like a 3.5 to 4 year process. We've just done it on recruiting. And when we announced it, we actually called it interim, but that was a 3.5 year process. And we'd already been talking to a lot of corporates and vendors prior to that point, but in an informal way. And when you look behind when you look at what goes into this, this is not about vendors filling in a spreadsheet or a form and then us go, okay, yeah, you're the leader, right? Yes, we want to know we want to know about what the vendors are and what they're doing in the roadmap, but you're the biggest point of view on this, the corporates. Yeah, it's the feedback we get from the customer that ultimately shapes our primary point of view around it, whether that's through our corporate research network members, so the ones where we have a much more active and probably beneath the kimono type conversations with, but also the general corporate inquiries, our public research processes, and I said, who are you doing it, what are you doing, who are you doing it with, and what do you think of them, those types of things. We then cross-validate that with a whole bunch of vendor inquiry. We put it together from multiple sources. We've got qualitative data. We've got a whole bunch of functional assessment stuff that we're doing with people. There's a lot of stuff that goes behind the scenes. Why is that all relevant? It's because you see a diagram and you're trying to make a decision on the basis of a dot, right? Surely you should be making the decision on the basis of the data behind the dot, right? And ultimately, if I can, if you like, if there's a story for you in terms of engaging from a Fosway point of view more actively, it's, we have that and we have tools to enable you to understand what parts of that are most relevant to you and which 4 or 5 are most relevant to you. So think about how you can leverage some of that. In a learning systems point of view, this structure and the way we've been looking at it has incorporated looking at things like learning experience for a long time, right? We've been tracking this since before people started talking about LXPs. Right? When we originally used the NGLE classification 4 years ago, it was because I was sick of hearing people starting to say they were an LXP with no clue about what they were doing to do with learning experience, right? Just because you're a social learning platform doesn't make you an LXP, right? Any more than if you were an instructor-led training platform, you're an LXP, right? So you need to understand, we need to unpick the story. So we're assessing people through this. We do a lot of capture for it. We get lots of companies that kind of participate in this process. Every year it changes, right? I was saying to somebody earlier, when we look at a 9-grid, we rebase it every year, literally when we're looking at it. So you can have a vendor that's done lots of roadmap and they go backwards and they go, well, we've done loads of roadmap. We say, well, other people have done more, right? So it's relative to the overall market and the whole market is changing all the time. And as I said, it's more than a diagram. Read the reports. I would strongly emphasize those. There should be links to those on the landing pages or on our websites. Look at the trend sections, look at the ratings, and obviously, and I'll talk a little bit in a second, look at what the specialisms are for people and where they're doing. And it will tell you also how they're constructed. I just responded to a comment from Josh Bursin, who I know quite well, and he said, well, I think you're confusing things. What's performance and potential? So the answer was, RTFM. Everybody know what that means? All right? Just read the bloody report, okay? Because it will tell you what performance and potential is, and it will tell you how it applies within the learning system space, etc. It's really it's there to read, and there are background documents behind it. From a 2020, sorry?
I think one thing that's also worth accenting is the point that what the systems evaluations don't tell you is what the experience feels like, right? And what we're trying to do is accelerate that point where you know the functionality of what you're looking for, but enable you to start to think about the use cases and the personas that you're trying to buy for, so that actually you can judge the system not on does it have the functionality, but what does it feel like and what reactions do you get? Does it create engagement? Do people love it?
So I'm going to put this up in a minute. This is the 2029 grid for learning systems. Last year's had 33 and it was too crowded. This year's got 44. That didn't work too well, did it? We've added a lot more. But the key thing that we've done, which is really, really fundamental, is that we have stopped really looking at things and saying being next gen is a way of identifying you, right? Because all the LMS companies have added LXP kind of capabilities, Cornerstone, Saba, etc. Half the LXPs have backfilled LMS functionality because particularly mid-sized companies, they don't want multiple platforms. Now how do we tell the difference between those? And there was a bunch of people, and there's quite a lot of them downstairs, who were marketing themselves as an LXP. When you start to tell me what you do about learning experience, the answer was almost nothing different, but I'll tell you about my Netflix-style user interface, yawn, right? And unfortunately, I've been telling that gag for 3 years, and we still haven't worked out that that's not an innovative thing to be talking about. So we wanted to make some changes, and in particular, we really wanted to move away from talking about, you know, if it's an LMS or an NGLE or an LXP, et cetera, because it was becoming increasingly less meaningful. The other thing is, possibly one of the vendors we get the most questions around wasn't on it because we were excluded from including them, which was called Workday, all right? So if you're in large companies, et cetera. Now, one of the reasons that's really relevant is because if your HR director and CIO has already bought Workday, they're already telling you that they're going to replace your LMS with it. So we get a lot of questions. We've always had it. We've tracked it from before it pretty much existed, from when they did the original acquisition of the video company, and we've provided input to Workday around that kind of solution. But we weren't able to include it, as we can't with Oracle's Learning Cloud platform, because you weren't able to buy it separately. So we changed the rules in 2020 to enable you to be able to include most of the main solutions you're looking at, regardless of whether you can purchase it separately. Okay, so that's the reason that's been added. The suite, what we also chose to do was to say, as I said, we can't keep talking about things as LXPs. It just doesn't make any sense, or even NGLEs, whatever acronym we want to put in it. What we've got is kind of two basic types. We've got a type of vendor, whatever their origin is, who is trying to be the main, almost the backbone of your learning ecosystem or technology ecosystem, managing most of the forms of modern learning. You know, from formal learning to multiple learning channels, etc. They're now doing socials. They now have Netflix interfaces. They now have an LRS option on the back end of it, etc. They're trying to be a learning system suite. So I don't want to talk about LMSs. I want to talk about learning system suites, and we want to assess them like that. The other thing was, it was obvious when you looked at the LXP type things, or the NGLEs, that actually there were a bunch of people who were trying to do something different, something disruptive, but probably within a specific area. So they were trying to be the best people at doing micro-learning or adaptive AI-driven personalization or whatever it's going to do. Yeah? And it was really important to be able to recognize these guys were actually disrupting. So when you looked at it, the LMS suites or the learning system suites were kind of getting eaten above a little bit by HCM and eaten from below by the specialists. But just talking about them as if they were all an LXP was meaningless. So what we want to know is, yes, you're a specialist, but what's your specialism? Is your specialism programmatic learning? Is it mobile? Is it video? What is the thing that you are uniquely trying to drive value around? So somebody said, well, this is confusing buyers. It's the opposite. It's actually making people state what their specialism is. What is the thing that they are going to uniquely help you to do, rather than hiding behind a generalized LXP marketing label, which is ultimately fairly meaningless. And then think about how you build that into the ecosystem. So we announced that. It's been, the response to that has been really, really strong and very positive. There's been a few skeptics. There's a few vendors who are quite wedded to a marketing label, even though they're not there, so sometimes there's a bit of noise around it. But overall, I think the response to this has been really strong, and for us, it's a massive recalibration, really. So, the suites, you pretty much mainly know those, I'm sure, if you've looked at the learning technology market for a while. You know, the Cornerstones, the Sabas, success factors and Workday from an HCM perspective, but also people like Docebo and PeopleFluent, IMC, German company, Calidus down in the kind of, you know, in the sort of mid-market space. This is always calibrated towards enterprise customers. Yeah, this is not small businesses down here. You know, so this is, we're looking at minimum 1,000 employee companies as the audience for this. So these people you've probably mainly heard of. They move. There's trajectory change. These are the ones that you maybe haven't, right? So these are the specialists. So what we've tried to do is to identify to work out, so somebody is really trying to be a suite, or are they trying to be a specialist? And if they're trying to be a specialist, what's their specialism? So if you read the report, the table that now categorizes them has a specialism on it. So for example, you know, Skillsoft positioned that as an LXP for access, so that's Percipio to access their learning content. Training Orchestra is probably by far the leading company in the market doing instructor-led training optimization. If you spend lots of money on instructor-led training still and you run a lot of stuff, You know, they're probably by far the market leader in helping that, and they work, the key thing with all of these, they tend to work with other LMSs. They partner with them, right? So it's part of an ecosystem story. StoryShare, tiny company down there in the bottom left, what they do is mobile learning content delivery, yeah? So if you run, so an example, a client of theirs is Unilever, lots of mobile workforce. What they found was most of the mobile learning solutions actually can't deliver the content reliably to an audience on a phone anywhere in the world. So what they do is provide tools to help do that type of stuff, and so on. So you can see there's a whole range of them. And then ultimately, we put that together with the whole 9-grid. So what we now have is a combination of them. You'll notice most of the suites were smaller companies, typically innovator companies. Some of them are very fast growth, and actually some of them have attracted quite a lot of funding. There's a lot of private equity money and so on being pumped into the market to try and accelerate growth potential. So at that point, I kind of want to pause and just give you, see if anybody's got any questions about any of the vendors.
I have a microphone, and it's on. Is it on? No, it's not on.
It's not on. You shout.
Try again. There we go. I'll come down to the audience. If anyone's got a question, put your
Well,
hand
this
up.
is your one opportunity to get a free advice.
Over here. Okay.
Oh, a few hands went straight up there.
So, the nick of time.
Bit of a connected question, because there's a learning systems and a digital learning 9-grid, and I feel like some things belong in both places.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about content providers from companies like Coursera or LinkedIn Learning.
Yes.
Is that something that you are building a buyer's guide of or a 9-grid of?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And in the buyer's guide, it gives you both 9 grids. I didn't have the time here to really focus on it, and the suite specialist was the big story in some ways today, so that's why I wanted to focus on it. Digital Learning 9-grid is aimed at people, companies that they're typically hybrid, but they tend to be led by content or service. So originally that's evolved from being around bespoke e-learning and content providers towards companies that's created them bespoke solutions. Typically you'll find they'll provide content services and platform, but what they're trying to do, their DNA is more of a service company or et cetera. The Learning Systems 9-grid, these are software companies trying to sell you software solutions, but some appear on both, right? So Skillsoft is a content provider that's on digital learning, but it is now trying to position and sell Percipio as a generalized platform to access any content, not just Skillsoft's content. Cornerstone has started to disrupt the content marketplace quite aggressively with its content anytime proposition, where it's created whole bunches of curated content channels, curated content channels with a kind of pay-per-use model around that's being quite disruptive and is growing very fast. So for them, they see that content opportunity as being as big as the LMS opportunity for them, and they're the biggest LMS company, right? So effectively, you've got all of these things going on in terms of it. Any other questions? If you ask, I'll repeat.
Sure, I'll speak up. Given that these ecosystems are clearly a reality for all of us, why are there so few learning standards in this market, and how do you see that evolving? We seem to be still working on like SCORM and XAPI, which in themselves are decades old in some cases.
Did anybody wince when that question was asked? No. So where we look at your experience of being in the market. Yeah, I mean, the standards debate has been raging forever. And, I think the reality is it's always overplayed and underengaged from a corporate perspective. It's definitely relevant. I mean, people are looking obviously at using XAPI to track lots of content types, but the reality is it's tiny from a point of view of proportional activity. And it's not because tracking and things is not relevant, it's just because we track everything but in a different way in the digital world, right? So I think it's a source of frustration, and you can get very caught up with the hype around it and get very frustrated with the reality and the slowness of adoption. The reality is most companies are still running, when they're running SCORM, they're not even running the 2004 variant, right? So, they're still running a bit of that, and a lot of that was undeliverable, simple sequencing and all this kind of stuff around it. XAPI is growing, but we've often asked people where they are in terms of their XAPI adoption, and let me ask you, how many people of you are actively using XAPI today? Okay, we've got 3 people, and 2 of those are vendors. All right? So that tells you something around where we are. So the reality is this is something that corporates need to look at. It tends to be tick box. It appears on all the RFPs, but actually it's really not driving their kind of primary concern and focus. And you could get very trapped in that debate if you're not careful. But it's a question that almost gets asked every 3, 4, 5 years. It becomes kind of raises its head. It's frustration.
David,
any
over
other
here,
questions?
Over here on this side.
Okay, I got three questions. You can pick the one that you like.
I'll give you one as an option, and then we'll see. I'll be able to.
You're going to charge me for the second two. First of all, the shift to kind of SaaS platforms, how has that changed your job and the complexity of your job? Because features and functions are coming to market in real time from all these players.
Yes.
And even a 1-year cycle seems kind of tough, so that's question number one. Question number two is, in the broader software industry, there's been a big shift towards customer success, right? Post-sales engagement and support of companies adopting and deploying and usually sort of moving up the feature stack. It makes sense if you're in a subscription business model. I wonder how you see that playing out in this market. Are they all taking that seriously? And I can't remember what the third question is.
Right. So first question
Pace of
is,
innovation.
first one was, how is SaaS impacting and how does it change the way we look at it? So first of all, SaaS is great, right? From our point of view, we're a massive advocate of cloud and SaaS and ASP before that. And I'm talking about going back. I mean, I first was advocating doing that in the late 90s because why would companies spend CapEx on software when they were at that time trying to get rid of training centers and effectively rent and pay on a pay-per-use basis? So the idea of building massively expensive infrastructures doesn't make sense. It absolutely does accelerate innovation, and it also improves cost of ownership around it. We actively track all the vendors all the time, and we do we do briefings around them on an all-year-round basis. But we also have spikes of activity that are around when we get to a 9 grid. So we want to understand the latest story in that 3 months prior to a 9 grid.
And I think just to add to that, in terms of the pace of innovation and the new features that come because they are SaaS, we take the view of, yes, that's a nice feature. Show us a customer who's using that is being successful. And quite a lot of the vendors occasionally beat us up because we'll say, well, you haven't taken into account all these wonderful new features. And you say, well, you haven't got a customer who's using it. So we're trying to moderate their hurrah around the hype of this is wonderful into show us somebody who's being successful. Yeah. And then that helps us qualify. Because we can talk to people very actively and say, they've got these great new features. We'd love to see somebody adopt them and think it's been interesting. But that does moderate our assessment of them as well.
Yeah, I mean, the customer success story is, so one of the things I would say is being cloud is not a singular thing, right? Almost all of the cloud vendors that we track have gone through 4 or 5 generations of being in the cloud and re-architecting and changing the service management models and everything. Most of them have a customer success manager model. Most of the time that doesn't drive innovation in the customer particularly effectively. One of the things that obviously we're, as well as being maybe holding the mirror up to you, we also hold the mirror up to the vendors. And I've been very public in saying that, driving innovation in a product is irrelevant if you don't drive it into the customer. So I think all the vendors could do a better job of doing that. I'm kind of conscious of time, so what I'm going to do is just quickly wrap, because I'm sure Steve's going to blow his horn at some point. The research that we're talking about, the 9 grid reports, that's all available on our website. We have what we call Fosway Analyst Lounge on the right-hand side downstairs in the expo hall. The analyst team is down there, so if you want to come and ask some specific questions around them, etc., please come and do so, or obviously follow up with us afterwards. The main thing I'm just going to say is just remember that 9 grid is just the tip of the iceberg, whether it's for this or for HCM or for digital learning or whatever. There's loads of stuff. A lot of you send people to shows and wander around and then go out and do research, process into the market, etc. You're spending a lot of time doing that and not necessarily getting a very informed view. We get a lot of companies who end up coming to us having done that and then still being confused about what they want, especially around that LXP, LMS ecosystem story. So if that, think about where we can help you accelerate that. We're not a consulting company, but we have a load of research and IP and tools that's designed to help you identify for you what the specific need sets are and which options are maybe the best ones for you to consider, and maybe what the weaknesses of them you need to consider as well. So that's something just to, and there is a kind of, we have what we call, we can either work in a couple of different modes. One of them is a critical friend or a sounding board, where you're just kind of asking us questions and using time, etc. The other one is with more structured processes around helping you validate what you need or potentially engage in the market. We've always done, most of our money historically has been from advising corporates and how to engage with this and get more success. And that's it. Thank you very much.